She is a professor of psychiatry at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis and is founder and director of the Washington University School of Medicine Early Emotional Development Program, or EEDP. The EEDP is a clinical research program that focuses on the study and treatment of effective clinical work and NIMH and NAR-SAD and CHAD, see, we've got the whole alphabet already this morning, and bear-funded research focuses more specifically on infant preschool mood disorders, particularly depression, clinical characteristics, biological markers, and alterations in the emotional development of young children associated with early onset mood disorders. Dr. Luby was awarded the Gerald Clearman Award for Outstanding Research from NAR-SAD in 2004, as well as numerous honorary lectureships. Dr. Luby chairs the Infancy Committee of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Dr. Luby has published extensively in numerous general and psychiatric journals on the issue of preschool and mood disorders and young child psychopathology. With that, help me welcome Dr. Luby.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I wanted to just sort of get a sense of the background of the audience members just so I can deliver the message most meaningfully. Could you just give me a show of hands if you think are lawyers or judges? And then how many are child care workers or mental health professionals? Okay, so mostly lawyers or judges. And you know, I'm more of that type. I'm used to talking to mental health professionals. Of course, but I really felt it was important to come here, and for some reason I had to fly almost all around the country to get here from St. Louis. But I was totally willing to do it because I feel like people in the legal system are really the people who need this information at this point. I mean, that's sort of the state of the science, that those of us in academics have been sort of researching this issue for 20 or 30 years, and we've now come to some pretty clear information that is really deliverable and should be acted upon in the legal system. And it sounds like in the state of Nebraska, you've got some very innovative programs. I know that there's problems and issues with those programs maybe functioning in the way everyone would like them to, but at least you've got some programs in place that seem to be attentive to early childhood mental health. And I think in terms of, I hope you'll conclude at the end of my talk that even if you're thinking about it from a political or economic point of view, it's really very, very intelligent to be working with children when they're young and to be focusing on the basic nurturing system these children experience. So what I want to talk about today is sort of the state of the science that really has shown at this point how early trauma and early life experience materially changes the way children's brains develop, and how early nurturance also materially changes the way children's brains develop. So, I mean, we've known this in animals for many, many years, but we now have data really showing that the early parent-child or caregiver-child relationship is tremendously important for healthy brain development and, you know, for the construction of productive, healthy citizens later in life. So I'm going to talk a little bit about preschool onset depression, but I'm going to use that more as a model for what we know about early childhood disorders. And then I'm going to talk more about the issue of parenting and brain development. So this is just, I'm sort of required to disclose how our research is funded, so that you know that it's not funded by pharmaceutical companies or other proprietary. These are either federal funding agencies or private funding agencies that fund mental health research. And importantly, my key collaborators who are two neuroimagers. I personally am focused on child psychopathology and emotion development. Neuroimaging is not my specific area of expertise, but I work with some very, very talented people in neuroimaging who I've coerced into doing neuroimaging on younger and younger children, and despite their better judgment, they agreed, and it turned out to be very, very productive. So the Early Emotional Development Program is a program that we started at Washington University over 20 years ago, and it really is focused on, we do mental health evaluations of children under 5, but we're focused on looking at the normative trajectory of emotion development and how that interfaces with the onset of early mental disorders. So emotion development is really something that is sort of a new area of research for developmentalists. We know a lot about cognitive development, we know a lot about motor development, speech development, but no one has really tracked or understood that much about emotion development. And of course, it's very, very important when we understand the development of things like depression or bipolar disorder or the group of disorders that we call affective or mood disorders. So we're looking specifically at how deviations in normal emotion development give rise to risk for early onset mental disorders. And certainly children who are in the DFS system or the legal system, the types of kids that you're seeing, are at tremendous risk for problems in emotion development. And my guess is that those things aren't necessary, you're not necessarily looking at these kids through that lens. So one thing that we know based on, maybe 50 years of writing and maybe 20 or 30 years of empirical scientific research is that mental disorders do arise in childhood. It's pretty clear that, and this is based on a converging body of evidence, that mental disorders definitely arise in kids as young as 3. Some disorders may be as young as 2. And I mean, that's surprising even to your general child psychiatrist. And many people don't even, still don't believe it, but that's actually ignorant because it goes against the body of evidence. So it is clearly true that these disorders can be defined. They do arise early, and I'll tell you what types of scientific experiments we do that lead us to know that that's true. And the reason why it's important is because we also know that intervening in these disorders as early as possible in life is much more effective than it is as opposed to catching them later when people are adults, when people are adolescents, or even in middle childhood. So the other principle is that the young brain is what we call very neuroplastic. It's very, very changeable. In contrast to what many people believe, young children are actually very responsive to stresses in the environment, very responsive to nurturance in the environment. It's not that these things don't make a difference to them or don't have an impression on them, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but there's still a lot of common belief that younger children are just they don't perceive stresses, it doesn't really affect them, and that's clearly not true. And going along with that is this neuroplastic brain, the fact that the brain is changing very, very quickly. The idea of neuroplasticity is that it's changing much more rapidly in early childhood than it is in later childhood, and that what we also now know is that the environment leaves a huge imprint on the brain. It carves out the way the brain changes and develops. So that's the other reason why it's so important to focus on risk for mental disorders early, as I believe many of the children that you're seeing clearly would be in high-risk groups, and also intervention and sort of preventive intervention or just early intervention based on brain change and brain development. So we know that mental disorders can arise as early as age 3. The data that we have really refutes this idea that children who have behavioral problems, these are just normative and they'll simply grow out of it. I mean, obviously that can be true too, but we now sort of know a lot about the distinction between normative behavioral problems and things that cross the boundary into what we call mental disorders. And then I just said the reason why early identification is so important, because you really have the opportunity to have a much bigger impact on a younger child than you do on an older child or an adolescent. And that's been proven in many, many areas of research. One really powerful example of this that's gained a lot of traction is in the treatment of autism. So we now can identify autism. There's signs that are identifiable even as early as 6 months of age. You can certainly clinically identify it at 18 months of age, and intervening before 5 years of age is very, very important and clearly far more effective than waiting until later. And this is, thought to be related to this issue of neuroplasticity that I've just been talking about. So one question is, how is a disorder validated? And this is, a question that applies to mental health and psychiatric disorders altogether. And people really started looking at this in the early 70s, and psychiatrists, in contrast to sort of their past traditions, started to think about the fact that mental disorders were biologically based disorders, just like neurological disorders, just like other medical disorders, and that we really needed to understand the underpinnings of those disorders and the physiologic basis of those disorders. That doesn't mean that the environment isn't a very, very important factor in some mental disorders, but we also know that there are big, big biological components to these mental disorders too. So it's the idea that mental disorders are really no different than disorders like diabetes. Diabetes is a good example of a disorder where there's genetic vulnerability to the disorder, but if you have certain kinds of diets, you're much more vulnerable to the disorder. So there's the interaction between the genetic and biological vulnerability and the psychosocial environment. And actually that's true, increasingly true, of many, many disorders, both medical and psychiatric. So the thing that's different about diabetes and a disorder like major depression, for example, is at this point we understand very relatively little about the neurobiology and pathophysiology of major depression. So we know a lot about diabetes and exactly how diabetes works physiologically in the body. We know so much about it that you can go to your doctor and get a simple blood test, and he or she can determine whether you have diabetes. That's not true of any psychiatric disorder. There's no psychiatric disorder that you can go to your psychiatrist. Your psychiatrist can do a blood test and tell you for sure you have this disorder or you don't have this disorder. And that's because the psychiatric disorders are basically based in the brain. The brain is inside this very, very hard bony structure called the skull to protect it. And because of that, it's also a very, very complex organ. So because of that, we don't know very much about how the brain works relative to how much we know about how the pancreas works or how the heart works or other organs in the body. We're starting to learn a lot about how the brain works through this tool of neuroimaging. And that's why the research in psychiatry has been starting to increase exponentially, both in psychiatry and neurology. But the basic idea here is that psychiatric disorders are really the same types of problems as diabetes, as heart disease. They're the same physiologic, the same interaction between genetic vulnerability, physiologic processes gone awry, and then the psychosocial environment contributing to those. So we do have ways of validating psychiatric disorders, and in general, what we do to validate psychiatric disorders is we look for several different things. One, do constellations of symptoms hold together in populations? So do people who are depressed, they have anhedonia, they have sleep problems, do those constellation of symptoms arise, cluster together in people? And are those people who have that constellation of symptoms different than healthy people, and are they different from people with other psychiatric disorders? So that would be discriminant validity and the idea of a stable, I think stable is a reasonable word, symptom constellation. The other thing we look for are are they familial? Do they run in families? Now they can be familial for a number of reasons. They can be familial because there's genes that are passed down from one generation to the next, and because behaviors carve out problems or strengths. They go from nurturer to offspring. So there's psychosocial familiality, and then there's genetic familiality. So we look for familiality, we look for stability, and we look for clusters of symptom constellations. We also look for biological markers, because we do hope someday that you could go to your psychiatrist, and your psychiatrist would be able to do a blood test that might confirm whether you do or don't have a disorder. The more we understand the physiology of the disorder, the closer we get to that. But I'll tell you a little bit about some of the biological markers we know about in depression as one example. Okay, so these are things I just said. Disorders run in families, that there's biological markers, and we also look at longitudinal force. This isn't, some disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder might not have a stable longitudinal force. They might be something that people can not rapidly, but can recover from over a period of years. Other disorders have a more chronic longitudinal course. So we do look for longitudinal stability to understand that we have valid psychiatric disorders. And there's numbers of studies have been done on this, showing the validity of a number of psychiatric disorders. But it is interesting to know that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, what we call the DSM system, which you probably see in your courtrooms or you see it referred to, actually most of the disorders in that DSM system are not validated. It's sort of the best thing that we have, and many of those disorders are sort of consensus diagnoses of clinicians sitting around the table agreeing. There's another version of the DSM coming out that we hope is more empirically based. But the state of the science is that the findings have not been fully incorporated into the DSM system. So why is it important to identify mental disorders early in life? Well, this is really something I kind of just talked about. Early intervention is more effective in a number of conditions. Autism, that's clearly demonstrated. It's also true of early disruptive disorders. So when you intervene with 3- and 4-year-olds who have disruptive behavior, you're going to have much better outcomes than you wait until the kids are 9, 10, or adolescents. That's partly because there's a steep developmental trajectory early in life. There's just, even if we don't consider brain development, the young child is rapidly changing in all kinds of different developmental domains, so that you have a bigger opportunity to make change, and this is associated with greater brain neuroplasticity. It's really this issue of brain neuroplasticity that is so key and is so important and should really make us focus on this early childhood period. And the correcting problems is important so it doesn't have a ripple effect across later phases of development. The other issue is that when children are developing on this steep developmental trajectory, if they have a mental disorder, if they have a trauma, it's going to alter all kinds of other phases of their development. They're not going to develop cognitively in the same way. They're not going to develop socially in the same way. So it throws off development, and that's the other reason why it's so important to identify these problems and to intervene. So myths about early childhood that are relevant to mental health. Myth 1 is that infants and young children are not aware of their surroundings and cannot process psychological events. So, many people believe if there's a 2-year-old who's been abandoned by a mother, a 12-month-old who's been abandoned by a mother, the child's too young to really process what's going on. It doesn't really make that much difference. That is absolutely untrue. Young children are too immature to be vulnerable to disorders like depression and anxiety. And it's true that the general public really does believe that that's true, but that is absolutely false. I mean, the research data shows that is absolutely false. You can have an anxiety disorder at age 2, at age 3. You could clearly have depression as young as age 3. Myth 3 is that behavioral and emotional problems in early childhood will be transient and nonspecific. Up until now, many people who thought about early childhood mental health tended to think about big clusters of symptoms. They talked about externalizing problems, disruptive behavior, aggression, temper tantrums, or they talked about internalizing problems, being withdrawn, being shy, being inhibited. We now understand that those broad ways of looking at early childhood mental disorders really are not as useful. And in fact, young children can get specific, discrete disorders like anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, ADHD, attention deficit disorder. So we know that we can actually describe these things in a much more specific way. It's very important to do that because we can also then know how to treat these disorders more specifically and more effectively. Okay, so let's focus on early childhood depression, not because you're an audience that's tremendously interested in depression, but because it's sort of an example of a DSM-4 disorder that's well known in adults, that we actually have a pretty decent understanding of pathophysiology of, but no blood test to diagnose it. And we've been actually doing work on early childhood depression for over 20 years and have collected a body of scientific data, as have other investigators in independent labs, basically showing that children as young as age 3 can get clinical depression. Now, that you may be able to get clinical depression at age 2 also. It's just we haven't yet done those studies. No one has yet done those studies. We know that the effects of exposure to depression have been detected even in infancy. In fact, some of the first studies that were done in early childhood development looked at depressed mothers and their infants, and basically found that the infants of depressed mothers were emotionally and affectively different than the infants of healthy mothers. So again, speaking to the point that even a 6-month-old is very, very sensitive to the mood state of their caregiver, and this has a material impact on their own development and perhaps even on their, very likely on their brain development. I mean, one thing we also know, and that's sort of a duh thing, is that emotions and behaviors are directly linked to changes in brain. We're now doing lots and lots of studies to document that, but I mean, the brain is the organ that produces emotions and behaviors. When we say, I love you from the bottom of my heart, we're really saying, I love you from my amygdala. So it's truly brain-based. So preschool onset depression appears to be an early onset of the same disorder that's known in older children and adolescents. And we know that because we actually have a population of children who we started studying when they were 3, and now they're 15, 16, and 17. I'm going to show you some data. We did brain imaging on those children, and we've linked their brain development directly to some of the characteristics of their caregiving environment when they were 3. Again, speaking to the importance of that period for healthy brain development. Okay, so we've got a bunch of studies that support the validity of preschool depression based on these things that I told you: biological markers, familial transmission, and observational evidence. So in other words, it's not just that their mothers say they're withdrawn and they're sad. We observe them in play. Blind raters observe them in play and rate them as appearing differently than healthy developing preschoolers. And you might say, well, a preschooler's depressed, so what? What difference does that make? Well, in fact, these preschoolers are actually impaired in multiple settings. They're rated by their preschool teachers as having more trouble socializing, more trouble engaging. They're rated by their family members as being impaired in family functioning. So it does make a difference in terms of the productivity or the sort of quality of life of these preschoolers. In addition, now several studies have actually, epidemiologic studies, where they look at big populations, thousands of people in the general population, and they've detected depression as young as age 3 in big population studies in Norway, in North Carolina, in upstate New York, and so, you know, clearly we find it in the environment, and we find it in the, it's not just an American phenomenon, it happens across the globe. So one of the things about depression, when we look for a physiological or biological marker, is that many people for many years, in fact, really it was in about the 1980s, that people started getting interested in depression as a disorder of stress hormones or stress reactivity. So many people think about depression as a disorder where someone's stress hormones have gone awry. The depressed individual runs around in a very high stress state, and they have high levels of circulating stress hormones in their bloodstream. Important to know that sort of having hot stress hormones be high is an important thing to do if you're in a dangerous situation. If you're about to be attacked by a lion, you want your stress hormones to be high because it helps you escape and activate the system. If you're waking up every morning in your normal life and your stress hormones are high, this isn't good for you because the stress hormones actually attach to certain receptors in the brain and are actually neurotoxic to the brain. So people who run around with high stress hormones chronically actually are known to have smaller brain regions that are very important to cognitive functioning and emotion regulation. So what we knew in the 1980s is there was actually, we thought we had our first blood test to detect a psychiatric disorder. That was called the dexamethasone suppression test, and it tested whether, in fact, you could suppress your stress hormones or whether your stress hormones maintained this high elevated state no matter what the circumstances were. And it was true that depressed people were non-suppressible. They had high stress hormones no matter what. The problem, we almost thought this was a clinical sort of test for depression. The problem is people with eating disorders had it, and people with a whole variety of other disorders had it too, so it wasn't specific for depression. But nonetheless, as sort of a biological marker of depression, many, many studies have been done showing that depressed people have these high stress hormones and that their stress hormones sort of don't naturally fluctuate in the healthy way a healthy individual should during the day. We looked at this in our 3 to 5-year-olds with depression, and this chart just sort of shows you that they also have these elevated stress hormones. So this middle line, these 2 middle lines are our depressed preschoolers. The upper line is a group of people who have what we call melancholic depression, characterized by the symptom of anhedonia, which means inability to enjoy activities and play. That's a very abnormal thing in a 3 to 5-year-old, although I'm sure you're seeing it in a lot of the populations that you're working with. And it's important and it should be paid attention to. In any event, these depressed groups, you can see, they come, this is their stress hormone, cortisol, measured during a laboratory paradigm that has multiple stressors occurring. So this group is a group of healthy children. This group is a group of children with disruptive disorders. So they have things like oppositional defiant disorder or ADHD. What you see here is that the depressed children have just a qualitatively different shape of their curve. And these are statistically significant. They come into the lab. Everybody finds coming into the lab somewhat stressful. This is actually not statistically different. But the point is that these depressed kids just get increasingly stressed throughout the duration, and they stay stressed, whereas the healthy adaptation, and even the other psychiatric group has this healthy adaptation, is to be stressed by some things, and then to relax, and then to be stressed by other things. So it's the idea that even in these younger children with depression, they also have this basic physiologic alteration. So that was another piece of the evidence base that showed us this looks like the very same disorder we see in our 30-year-olds with depression, and our 18-year-olds with depression, and our 50-year-olds with depression. Okay, so what does a depressed preschooler look like? Well, one thing that is important to know, and this is generally true of early childhood mental disorders, is that in general, the disorders look the same. They have the same core characteristics as disorders in older children and adults. The issue is that we have to consider the developmentally adjusted manifestations. So we wouldn't think about a 30-year-old as not enjoying activities and play. We think about things like decreased libido in a 30-year-old. But in a preschooler, the inability to enjoy activities and play is clearly abnormal. And if you have that in a sustained way, that child requires a mental health evaluation. But otherwise, they basically have the same, what we call typical or core symptoms of depression and vegetative signs. Depressed people also have what we call vegetative signs. They get sleep disturbances, they get appetite disturbances, they have changes in their levels of physical activity, and these are some of the other signs of depression that we also see in kids. Other things we look for are things like, in the emotional domain, as I was talking about. Depressed preschoolers have excessive guilt. When transgressions occur that aren't necessarily their fault, they feel guilty about them. If transgressions occur that are their fault, they feel guilty about them and they don't recover from the feelings of guilt. They have sustained deep levels of guilt that they can't get away from. So these are other things that we look at in our studies that help us differentiate a depressed young child from a healthy young child. I already talked about the symptom of anhedonia, and then these are just other symptoms. And I already mentioned the fact that these depressed preschoolers are what we call functionally impaired. That's usually sort of the threshold in the DSM symptom for what we define as clinical caseness. You have to be functionally impaired, or you have to be very distressed internally in order for your problems to meet the threshold that it requires clinical intervention. We didn't have that threshold. You know, everybody has minor emotional or behavioral disturbances, and they don't all need to see psychiatrists. Okay, so this is just a slide that shows you is this issue of specificity. This looks at, in our sample, depressed preschoolers compared to those with other disorders, anxiety disorders and disruptive disorders, and then the third bar are healthy. And what this shows you is that across the bottom are the symptoms of depression. So what it shows you is that depressed preschoolers have these symptoms at much higher levels than anxious preschoolers or preschoolers with other disorders or healthy preschoolers, showing that the idea of just thinking about young children as having disorders or not having disorders is really, we've moved way beyond that. We really can look at much greater specificity. Okay, the other thing that was sort of a key piece of evidence in the database, and when I say that, these are the things that sort of convinced the skeptical adult psychiatrists that depression in preschoolers really exists. One was the biological marker, the other is the specificity that I just showed you, but this is the longitudinal stability. So basically when we followed these preschoolers into school age, and really after the age of 6 or 7, 98% of mental health clinicians believe that people older than 6 or 7 can get depressed. That we got over in the early 1980s. What's harder for them to understand is that even younger that you can get depressed. But what we showed is that these preschoolers who were depressed had a very, very high likelihood of having a recurrence of depression when they were school age, sort of showing longitudinal stability, or what we call homotypic continuity. In other words, that the preschool depression wasn't something that just spontaneously went away, no longer made a difference in the child's life, they didn't grow out of it. It wasn't something that turned into something else. They didn't then become kids with ADHD. They actually had a recurrent of the same disorder, which also underscores and speaks to the fact that of why it's important to identify it early and to treat it early, because presumably we might be able to actually change the chronicity or change the trajectory if we treat this early. And I think that general principle applies to all kinds of things that we're going to that you're going to encounter with early childhood emotional and behavioral disturbances. So what are the clinical and public health implications? Preschool depression does not spontaneously remit, therefore it requires clinical attention. It's not a non-specific precursor of later, more general psychopathology, therefore it requires a specific intervention. And it has numerous features that are very similar to the school-age form, therefore it appears to be the same disorder with an earlier onset. So again, this is just one example of a preschool mental disorder, and much of the same data has been evident in several other disorders too. So it just sort of speaks to the idea of the importance and the validity of early identification and early intervention. Okay, so one of the things that I've also been talking about is this issue of early mental disorders, early exposure to trauma and stress, early exposure to nurturance, and how that materially changes the way the child's brain develops. Now, I do think that this issue of looking at brain development, I mean, there's been data in the literature for 30, 40 years that have underscored the importance of the early parent-child relationship, of the early psychosocial environment. But when you show that it changes the way the brain develops, people in politics listen, people who make public policy listen, and for some reason it holds a lot more weight. I'm not really sure it should, but it does, because I mean, the behavioral data should have carried a lot of weight, but for some reason it didn't. So one thing that we wanted to do was to address the question of, do these children who have these early mental disorders, when we scan their brains when they're late school age, do their brains look different? And maybe they don't have a disorder at that point. Do their brains look different than healthy developing children? And we look at two aspects of brain development. We look at both the structure of the brain, we look at various brain regions, and we look at the size and the shape of those regions. And then we also look at the function of these brain regions. So we put these kids in the brain scanner, we show them different kinds of stimuli on a screen, like faces of emotion faces, and then we record how various aspects of their brain react to those emotion faces. This is basically what brain imaging does across the age span. So essentially, what we found so far, and I'll go into a little bit more detail, but this is just a summary statement, is that we have increased activation in the emotion regulatory regions in response to emotion stimuli based on depression under the age of 6. So if you had depression when you were 3 to 5, your brain, and even if you're no longer depressed when we scanned you, your brain is different. You respond to emotional stimuli. You're more reactive to negative emotional stimuli than a healthy developing person is. There's also, the other thing we look at in brain imaging that's become a very, very interesting thing is something called connectivity. We looked at how various regions of the brain communicate with each other. And this is emerging as a very, very important thing in terms of understanding behavior and how different people's brains function. So we know there are also different patterns of connectivity in children, school-age children who had depression when they were younger. In fact, the patterns of connectivity suggest sort of an increased internal ruminative focus. So in networks that are sort of internally focused. So again, it's the idea that there's an abnormality in the brain that persists because you had an episode of depression at age 6. The other thing that we found, and I'm going to talk about this in more detail, is that those children who had depression at age 6 had smaller hippocampuses, and the hippocampus is a very, very important brain region that controls cognitive ability and emotion regulatory ability. So having had this episode of depression at age 6, and presumably also children who experience trauma or early life stress are vulnerable for this smaller hippocampus. Okay. The other thing we've also looked at is actually doing scanning on depressed preschoolers themselves. And this is very, very novel. It was funded actually by a local private funding agency because I'm sure we couldn't have gotten the NIH to fund it, only because nobody really believed you could scan preschoolers. But the bottom line is, and actually since I put up this slide, we have more data that basically shows that depressed preschoolers' functional brain activity is different than healthy preschoolers' functional brain activity. And it's different in exactly the same way that we know depressed adults' functional brain activity is different than healthy people. So in other words, it's the idea that these changes in brain are already occurring in very early childhood, just sort of speaking to the importance of these early childhood disorders, events on brain function. Okay, and then this just goes to, this was actually an article in the New York Times Magazine in 2010. And what was interesting is it was sort of a summary of the findings to date on depression in preschoolers. And there were lots and lots of letters to the editor that sort of betrayed that people didn't believe that preschoolers could be depressed. And importantly, a heavy reaction about the fear that this somehow meant that we would be giving psychotropic drugs to preschoolers. And that was what the big reaction was about. And these two things are really two completely separate issues. So because we discovered depression in preschoolers doesn't mean the next step is to prescribe Prozac. In fact, we actually have developed some treatments, actually an adaptation of PCIT, of which many of you may be familiar with, to treat preschool depression, which is just a parent-child relationship therapy that appears to be effective. Okay, so the important part of this lecture is really this piece. And it's the question of how the early environment impacts brain development. I guess I think this is most important to this audience as you're considering making decisions about, whether to keep children in homes, whether to look for how important it is to put children with nurturing caregivers, how important it is to focus on the impact of early life stress and early nurturance on the developing brain. This is what I think this data is very important to in terms of those decisions. So one thing, where we begin is that early studies in animals, particularly in laboratory rats, we've known really for 20, even 30 years that the environments in which laboratory rats are raised actually change their brain structure. So they took laboratory rats and they put them in sort of highly stimulating, complex environments, and they found that those rats had increased neuronal development, much bigger brains, much more developed brains, when they compare them to laboratory rats who were put in low stimulating environments. So it's the idea that the early environment, we know from laboratory animals, was already materially changing the brain. And it's now well accepted that brain development is determined both by genetic factors, but also by environmental factors. And this is where we have a real opportunity here. And there's also evidence, I talked about this issue of neuroplasticity, that the brain is more plastic or changeable early in life. The other thing that goes along with this is there's something called sensitive or critical periods. And those are early periods in life when the brain is particularly sensitive to change or when there's a closing window of opportunity. One of the most famous critical periods is in language development. If you were to take a 2-year-old and put them in a household where 3 languages are spoken, they would learn those languages much more rapidly than an adult with an IQ of 150, because the brain acts like a sponge at that point in terms of its learning. So there's a critical period for language development. There's also what appears to be a critical or sensitive period for attachment, which of course I'm sure those of you working in childcare know about. It's the idea that the attachment relationship is developed in the first 18 months of life and is concretized, for the next 12 months or so. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important not to have children have multiple placements and be placed in 5 different foster homes in the first 2 years of their life, because then attachment does not develop. So this is where these legal decisions need to be informed by the child development research, which is clearly, it's no longer in question. So this is just sort of kind of shows you the experiment with the laboratory rats. Cage C is the stimulating environment. Cage B is the really low stimulating environment. And what you see is that the rats who are in Cage C have much bigger and better developed brains than the rats in Cage B, and it goes sequentially. A looks better than B, etc. Okay, the other thing that we also know, and this is actually in humans, is that parental nurturance is directly related to the development of memory in children. So the children who were raised in a much more nurturing environment have better memory than children who are raised in a less nurturing environment. So I mean, this is quantitative and tremendously important. Similarly, children who are raised in stimulating environments have much better language scores than children who are raised in low stimulating environments. So these things are clearly having a material impact on children's development, not just in mushy ways, but in very, very important ways in terms of their cognition. Okay, this is just I'm going to skip that one. All right, so let's take a look at environment and brain development in humans. A few studies now are provided that inform this issue, but this is very, very new. And this is mostly because only more recently have our neuroimaging techniques allowed us to really take a look at this. And obviously, it's not that we can't do an experiment like the experiment in the caged rats in humans, although unfortunately we find naturalistic experiments going on around the world, particularly in children in institutional settings, and children in foster care, et cetera, et cetera. So 2 studies have investigated young children in institutional settings compared to those who started in an institutional setting and who were adopted out. And these 2 studies are tremendously important and tremendously informative, particularly for the kind of work you do. Okay. So this is a study that actually looks, the study is taken from a group of children who were in a European institutional setting. Some were adopted out early into family units, and others stayed in the institution. And what we know is that the children who stayed in the institution basically had larger brain regions. Now this is where bigger is not better. They have bigger amygdalas. The amygdala is a brain region that's focused on sort of emotion processing. But having a bigger amygdala actually is correlated with poorer emotional processing functioning, because sometimes a bigger brain region means there's more scarring or more other kinds of cells that aren't necessarily functional cells. So what it shows you is that the children who were adopted out later actually had smaller amygdalas and better emotional functioning than the kids who stayed in institutions. Okay, now this is a very, very important study that's been widely publicized and is directly informative to the type of research, to the type of work that you guys do, called the Bucharest Early Intervention Study. This was funded by the MacArthur Network. It was conducted over the last decade. Basically what they did is they went to Bucharest to an institutional orphanage where children were maintained in this orphanage, and they designed a therapeutic sort of adoption option so that children were adopted into therapeutic foster homes. What they looked at is the difference in functioning. They didn't actually do brain imaging, but they did all kinds of different cognitive testing. And they looked at both differences in children who were reared in the institution compared to children who were adopted into these therapeutic foster homes. But they also looked at the issue, and this is what's important, is whether it made a difference if you were adopted earlier compared to later. And basically what this study found is that those children who were adopted earlier had much, much better cognitive outcomes than children who were adopted later. What it showed is that being adopted out of the institution before 2 years of age made a huge difference in terms of your capacity to recover and get back on the developmental track. And this is the other take-home message to those of you working in the legal system, is the importance of establishing the nurturing environment as early as possible. And I know that there's the balance of the parent's legal rights and the child's environment. Of course, I think the child's environment far exceeds the concerns about the parent's legal rights, only because the importance of the child's nurturing environment, the stability of the environment, and the nurturing environment as early as possible appears to make a huge difference in terms of the child's later outcomes. Okay, so this is basically just the data showing you that things like IQ scores and other types of developmental quotients are much, much better when these children are placed before 24 months of age as opposed to after 24 months of age. So it even suggests that waiting until after age 2, you've missed a window of opportunity. And this goes along with what I'm talking about, neuroplasticity and critical periods. Okay, so what are the public health implications? The results underscore the negative sequelae of early institutionalization. Clearly, this is well known, that early institutionalization is very bad for children on all developmental domains. And the idea of the importance of having a nurturing primary caregiver that is stable. I mean, there's probably nothing more important for a child's overall development, period. Results suggest possible sensitive periods of cognitive development and closing windows of opportunity for recovery. Results underscore the advantages of family placement in early childhood, before 24 months of age. Okay, so again, it's kind of similar. I mean, this is sort of a natural experiment that's kind of similar to those rat experiments. That when children are in these nurturing environments, as opposed to these hypo-stimulating environments, they do better. And an increased IQ score is going to be related to some measure of brain function and brain change. Okay, so another study that informs this issue is a Canadian study that looks at brain development in children who are exposed to mothers who have chronic depression. So they followed these samples for about 10 to 12 years. And they have a group of children who are exposed to mothers who have been in a state of pretty much chronic and recurrent depression compared to children who are with a healthy, non-depressed mother. Then they did neuroimaging of the groups. And they focused on these two brain regions. I've been talking about these two brain regions. One is the hippocampus, which is the area that I told you gets smaller in depressed individuals. When you have high levels of circulating stress hormones, it is neurotoxic to the hippocampus because the hippocampus has a lot of receptors for stress hormones. And then the amygdala, which is really it's sort of like the emotion processing way station. So things happen in the environment, your amygdala sort of experiences those phenomena and makes a determination. Is this a happy event? Is this a sad event? It sort of is the emotion labeling center. So people have been very focused on these two brain regions, both structurally and functionally. And what they found is that children who are exposed to chronic depression in their mothers have larger amygdalas. Remember, bigger amygdalas are not better, although bigger hippocampuses are better. They didn't find the difference in the hippocampus. So this is very consistent with that earlier study that I showed you of the kids who were in the institutions longer having larger amygdalas too. Okay, so one question that's also interesting those are just studies that sort of show you that the child's psychosocial environment, and particularly referenceable to the primary caregiver, makes a difference in terms of key brain outcomes and these key regions. The other question is, how does that work? Why does that work? And while we may not be able to answer that question in humans just yet, a lot of people have actually studied this for decades and really uncovered the mechanism of action in animals. So in laboratory rats, basically a number of complicated studies have been done that basically show that nurturance, rats who experience a nurturing caregiver, that is a mother rat who licks her baby very, very frequently, the nurturing behavior, actually have better stress management, better brain functioning, and more adaptive. And what they found is that the licking, the nurturing behavior, actually turns on a gene that produces a whole cascade of effects that basically makes the hippocampus larger. So that there's the connection between, this is where there's the connection between the psychosocial environment and the biological physiology. That the actual experience of being licked or being nurtured seems to turn on the genes that then produce protective factors and enhance brain development. So those rat pups who experienced high licking were better able to modulate stress, they had a larger hippocampus, and they were also more nurturing of their own offspring. So, I mean, if there's anything we can think about as a society that we want to change the cycle of, this to me would seem to be it. So this is basically this has been beautifully mapped out by some researchers in Canada and some in California, basically showing that this high licking behavior actually does what's called demethylation of the gene that causes that gene to express itself, and it produces a bigger hippocampus, and that's the brain region we want to be bigger. So just showing you that it's not just your predetermined genes, it's actually what you experience in early life that may turn on or turn off genes that enhance positive development. So we wanted to look at this issue in our sample of depressed preschoolers. So what we did, since we've been studying these kids longitudinally, we captured them when they were between 3 and 5. Part of the assessment that they underwent at 3 and 5 was a parent-child interactional assessment, where they were interacting with their parent in a mildly stressful circumstance, which I'll tell you about. We videotaped it. Blind coders who didn't know anything about the diagnostic status of the kid rated the parent's behavior and rated the child's behavior. So we had a measure, an objective measure of parental nurturance when the children were preschoolers. Then we imaged their brains when they were between about 7 to 9. And basically what we found is that the children who experienced very supportive mothers at the preschool age had much larger hippocampuses, very similar to what I just showed you with the laboratory rats who were licked a lot. So that these children, what we did was called the weighting task. So it's a task that's widely used in developmental research. There's an attractive gift that's placed in the room. The mother is told to complete paperwork. And the child, of course, is dying to open this gift. And what we coded is how the mother manages the child's frustration, and whether the parent is supportive or nurturing, whether the parent ignores the child, whether the parent punishes the child or gets angry with the child. And so those children who had high nurturance had much larger hippocampuses. And this, this was a very, very novel finding. It was published in a very general science journal called the Proceedings for the National Academy of Science. So it went way beyond just in the interest of mental health. It really is a very important finding in terms of brain development, which is the first real link that we know of how experienced nurturing in early childhood actually changes how the brain develops. So the idea that those children who experience more supportive caregivers, and it doesn't matter who the caregiver is, it can be the mother, the father, the grandmother, who's ever the foster parent, who's ever the primary caregiver, those children had much larger hippocampuses, about 10% bigger than children who did not experience a lot of nurturance. We also found it on both sides of the hippocampus. We also found what we call was an interaction effect, where this effect was more evident in non-depressed children than it was in depressed children, suggesting that in depressed children there are other processes going on, and just having a nurturing caregiver may not be enough. So this data really and this just is a graphic that sort of shows you when you have low depression severity and a very supportive mother, your hippocampus is much bigger compared to those other 3 conditions, which are variations of, we looked at just the issue of low or high depression severity and low or high maternal support. But you can see high maternal support is making a big, big difference in terms of how big this key region of your brain is. Okay, so basically what this just shows you is, early maternal nurturance, tremendously important to this area of the brain called the hippocampus, and also tremendously important to later childhood outcomes. The other things we've talked about are the idea of neuroplasticity, which is the reason why it's important to identify children's problems early, why it's important to intervene early, the idea of a critical or sensitive period, which is the idea of the reason why you shouldn't let children linger in environments in which there are early life stresses or low nurturance, and why decisions should be made early in a child's life to put them in a nurturing environment. And that pretty much wraps it up. So we have maybe about 15 minutes for questions, right? Okay. Yes?
Thank you so much for that presentation. It's like keep your brain for hours. It's really fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I had a couple of questions. I follow the work of Dr. Gamarate, who works a lot in looking at early childhood psychiatric issues as well. He's on Canada. And he's talked a lot about how this sort of the structure of our societies now, with children being, placed with non-primary caregivers, and often parents having not having a lot of information about what is a nurturing environment, what is an optimal environment to place their children in, and then not having a lot of choices. Often economically means that children are undergoing sort of incredibly traumatic breaks from their family into daycare settings, and that in and of itself is causing a lot of issues. And so I just wanted to kind of see what your take was on that. And the other thing was, I was wondering if there was any, if you looked at the starting IQs of children when you were looking at depression in children, because some of the symptoms that you're talking about are also sometimes more present in gifted population of children, concern with death or larger issues, lack of sociability, more focus on, more highly focused on one interest or task, not as playful in others. So those two things I will limit it to. But yeah.
No, those are good questions. The second one is a lot easier to answer than the first. So in our population, there are no differences in IQ between depressed and non-depressed preschoolers. Now, you raise an interesting point, and there could be differences, and it could also be EQ, emotional intelligence, more than IQ, which is cognitive intelligence. We haven't detected it, and we may not have a big enough sample to detect it, although I think we have the biggest sample of depressed preschoolers yet. But so we don't find differences, but it is an interesting question. And you're right, they do have more preoccupation with death. We see more, play themes in death. More, one thing is there's just this internal focus and this tendency to self-blame, which is a feature. The first question is a little bit more complicated. So, are you asking about children and daycare, or were you asking about children in foster care?
No, I'm asking about just daycare in general. Foster care, of course, we all sort of understand. There are questions about if you're taking a child from a not great environment to put them in a better environment, but what about that trauma of the break from the not great environment? Does that outweigh, does that trauma outweigh the benefit of taking them from a not perfect environment to a more perfect environment?
Right.
That's like a whole other thing. I'm just talking about generally, parents don't usually have this information on what is an optimal nurturing environment, and they've been told basically, if your kids in daycare, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine.
Right.
But they don't have a lot of resources to do that, so maybe they don't have the best choice.
True.
And so what do we do? Is that a traumatic event in and of itself?
Right. So, the issue of daycare has been studied pretty extensively by child developmental psychologists. There was a big multi-site study that looked at daycare, the effects of daycare, how early children go into daycare. And the bottom line really was, of course, that it depended upon the quality of the daycare. That if children are in a high-quality daycare where they have, where they're nurtured by the daycare staff, basically, going into daycare as early as 6 months of age appeared to be a reasonable and in some cases a good thing to do. In fact, I think if the home environment was not as nurturing, sometimes going into a nurturing daycare was actually protective. So it does depend upon the individual circumstances of the kid, and it depends upon the quality of the nurturance. I think the take-home message related to your question and this lecture has to do with the focus on the nurturing caregiver and helping caregivers to understand how to nurture children. I know a lot of the interventions that you guys are doing, we're doing some interventions in depressed pregnant women, also in very high psychosocial stress environments, and it does seem to be there's the idea that you can teach even a very depressed, even a drug-abusing, impoverished mother how to nurture their child, even amidst all these other psychosocial stressors. And to me, there's no more important thing to do in terms of in terms of the best interest of the child. Yes?
Follow up on the daycare issue, and it's not really a question, but it's a comment.
Sure.
And we've been trying to get judges and attorneys and social workers to focus on trying to get children, young children, in high quality and stable child care. So even if they're passed down a little bit from home to a foster environment, that there are some really excellent quality child care programs in most parts of the state, not all. And if they children at least stay in those programs, so they do some of those kinds of things and have that stability.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. Yes.
My question is how, I know there's the age of plasticity, but how long after that, what kind of impact can be made if you teach a depressed mother or a very depressed mother nurturing skills? If we're working hard on this, how long of a period of time is there hope in the longer periods? And I wanted you to speak to what the new research is.
Yeah. No, people often ask that question, of course, because I'm really emphasizing the idea of early intervention, early identification. That doesn't mean you should give up on the kid after they're 5. I mean, of course, even kids who have severe autism, even, at age 12, we continue to try to treat them, and we do make progress. So it's, and even in geriatric populations, there's still great plasticity. It's just that you're working against a stronger current. So, I definitely think there's still hope, and I definitely think treatment is still warranted and still should be aggressively pursued. The issue is just in those cases, the wait and see model, the they'll grow out of it model, the they're too young to have it model is clearly disproven. Yes?
How large was your population and where did you get them?
So the population that we originally recruited was about 305 kids, and we got them from the St. Louis community. So we recruited them from primary care sites, from daycares and preschools, using a screening checklist.
What was your screening checklist?
The screening checklist is something we developed called the Preschool Feelings Checklist. It's like an 18-question checklist. It's actually available on our website. Which is eedp.worcester.edu. Yes?
Did you look at temperament dimension at all in any of this?
Well, yeah, we do have temperament dimensions at various lines along the way. We haven't done any analysis specifically focused on that, but we will, and I'm sure it's important. Yeah. Yep. Yes?
Maybe not that optimal home environment, that social traumatic to pull them from the mother and that home environment, that even taking them from a less than optimal home environment to a more supportive foster environment is traumatic for the child. So, based on that, the nurturing, what you were talking about with daycare, and no matter who the provider is, the nurturer is, and stuff is the important part. Do you have an opinion about that kind of idea as far as that trauma of taking a child from the home and what that means?
That's a good question, and it is a complicated one. I think, of course, there's always going to, a child will experience trauma and extreme protest at being taken away from a primary caregiver, even if that caregiver is abusive. And has horribly abused the child. Children are attached to their care. They want their caregivers to love them, and they want those good relationships. So that's going to happen regardless of the quality of the caregiver in most circumstances, because that's the nature of early childhood. I think the issue, the more complicated issue, is what we call the optimal environment, and whether the caregiver is able to be nurturing to the child, and what are the core key ways, despite having lots of other problems. So the environment may not be optimal. That doesn't mean you should take the child away from the caregiver. The key question is the caregiver able to nurture and see the needs of the child and try to meet the needs of the child? And I think that's the key issue. And a caregiver who can't do that, has a total inability to do that, that's when I think, you've got to find a different placement. Yeah, how to make those determinations, you mean? Oh, to teach the nurturance skills. Absolutely, you've got to teach those skills, and it could, not all caregivers can learn those skills, but many can. Yes?
Is there any thought that if you have someone who has like adolescent depression, or they find out that they're depressed or they're an adult, is there any belief that they've been depressed all along, that the depression starts when they're tiny babies?
Yes, I mean, that may be true. And that's sort of how some of this work got started, because depressed adolescents or adults started reporting that thought they first experienced their symptoms in very early childhood. So it doesn't mean that everybody who has depression actually had it since they were very young, but it certainly is possible that people who have chronic depression may have had some of the first signs and symptoms when they were very young and they just went undetected. Okay, sounds like we wrapped it up. Thank you for your time.